Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're tracing a rapidly shifting and honestly, a deeply troubling period in American history, the position of African Americans leading up to 1914. Let's start with a staggering number. By 1890, 90% of African Americans still lived in the South. 90%. Most families were right where they'd been for generations, working primarily in farming or domestic service. This huge geographical concentration really sets the demographic stage for everything we're going to look at today, specifically their deteriorating legal and social position leading up to 1914. So here's our roadmap. We'll start with immediate post-Civil War freedom, track the relentless rise of segregation through the 1880s and 90s, look at the Plessy Doctrine, and end with the birth of early civil rights activism at the turn of the century. Section 1. The post-war reality. Freedom without resources. Now, while the end of slavery obviously granted legal freedom, a severe lack of material resources left many folks essentially trapped. And we see two very distinct types of prejudice emerge here. In the South, discrimination was de jure, meaning it was legally mandated by the state. But if you migrated north, you faced de facto discrimination. That wasn't enforced by the law, but rather by society and culture. Think of it like the difference between a legally locked door and a deeply unwelcome room. They both keep you out, right? Overcoming either of those hurdles was just incredibly difficult. Most families were tied to sharecropping or heavy physical labor just to survive. On top of that, building any sort of mass movement for equality is nearly impossible without education. Schools for African Americans only really popped up in the South after the Civil War, and those poorly funded institutions were heavily dependent on Northern white funding. Plus, as a reaction to emancipation, fearful white populations increasingly retreated into their own segregated institutions. Moving on to Section 2, Constructing Jim Crow and the Erosion of Liberty. As we roll into the late 1880s, Southern states started using the shield of states' rights to launch a systematic assault on civil liberties, and it happened sequentially. Step 1, remove political power. They brought in highly subjective voter registration tests. They'd sometimes give black voters forms in foreign languages or mysteriously lose their paperwork. Step 2, state legislatures established Jim Crow laws to strictly enforce physical separation. And Step 3, lacking the legal protections of citizenship, African Americans faced unchecked mob violence, which was used to enforce this new social hierarchy. The real trigger for the explosion of these laws was the 1896 Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson. You might know this one. Homer Plessy, a light-skinned man with 1/8 black ancestry, deliberately challenged a Louisiana law that required separate railroad carriages. Well, the Supreme Court ruled against him, which officially sanctioned a biracial society. They actually argued that enforced separation didn't imply inferiority, claiming that as long as facilities were separate but equal, they were perfectly legal. But not everyone bought into this legal fiction. The lone dissenting voice on the Supreme Court was Judge John Harlan. Ironically, he was a Southerner and a former slave owner himself, but he saw right through it. He stated the true intent was just to keep black passengers away from white ones. And he accurately predicted this decision would provoke, in his words, aggression more or less brutal upon the admitted rights of the colored citizens. And Harlan hit the nail right on the head. The equal part of separate but equal, it was instantly ignored. By 1899, in the case of Cumming v. Richmond Board of Education, the court actually allowed a Virginia county to build white-only schools without providing any schools for black students at all. This legally trapped black children in a severely underfunded educational system, locking in inequality for generations to come. Which brings us to Section 3, an era of violence and federal inaction. With a legal architecture of segregation now firmly in place, the turn of the century saw a horrifying surge in physical violence. Between 1889 and 1918, an estimated 2,558 black men were murdered by lynch mobs. That is nearly 100 people every single year, murdered entirely outside the law by groups claiming to serve justice. To put that into perspective, the sheer weight of these statistics points to a complete failure of Southern justice. If we look at a slightly broader window, from 1889 to 1929, out of 3,724 total lynchings, 85% of the victims were African American. Yet fewer than 50 perpetrators were ever arrested, and only 4 were sentenced. Just 4. Local politicians actively fueled this crisis too. For instance, South Carolina's Governor Ben Tillman openly participated in lynch mobs. He even bragged about events like the 1876 Hamburg Massacre, where 8 freed slaves were killed. And he faced zero consequences because he completely dominated local politics. So, you might be wondering, why didn't the federal government step in? Well, they simply claimed they had no jurisdiction, since murder was a state crime. In 1901, Congressman George Henry White, who was actually a former slave, proposed an anti-lynching bill to make it a federal crime, but it was soundly defeated. From 1891 to 1911, the ruling Republican Party essentially had no presence in the South and really no interest in fighting for black rights. And later on, Democratic President Woodrow Wilson actively made things worse by extending Jim Crow segregation right into the federal government itself. All right, Section 4, the rise of the middle class and divergent strategies. Despite this incredibly bleak reality, African Americans were building serious economic resilience behind the scenes. Because white companies across the South outright refused to serve black folks, a parallel black economy emerged out of sheer necessity. Now, the combo of white racism and laissez-faire capitalism kept a lot of people in poverty, but overall income and life expectancy for the poorest African Americans were actually going up. A new professional middle class was born, running shops and offering services exclusively for their own communities. The progress was slower than for white Americans, for sure, but it was progress. And this progress sparked a massive ideological debate over the path forward. On one side, you had Booker T. Washington. Born into slavery, Washington fought his way through poverty to establish the Tuskegee Institute in 1881. He essentially believed there was no racial prejudice in the American dollar. In his famous 1895 Atlanta Compromise, he advocated for vocational education, hard work, and peaceful accommodation with white society. He felt that economic success would slowly but surely erode racial prejudice. Then, let's look at his main antagonist, W.E.B. Du Bois. He was a free black man born in the North and the first African American to get a Ph.D. from Harvard. Working as a professor down in Atlanta, he witnessed the absolute horrors of Southern lynchings firsthand. Du Bois was disgusted by Washington's slow, cautious approach. He demanded an immediate end to racism, urging the use of aggressive legal and political action through what he called unceasing agitation. Which leads us to Section 5, the picture in 1914, the birth of organized resistance. You see, the horrific violence of the South eventually started bleeding into northern cities. After the 1900 New York race riots, and especially the devastating 1908 lynch mob riot in Springfield, Illinois, which was literally the birthplace of Abraham Lincoln, it became crystal clear that peaceful accommodation just wasn't working. This northern violence acted as a huge catalyst. It drove Du Bois and a group of white liberals to establish the NAACP in 1909, committing to completely abolish segregation. But by the eve of World War I, despite the vital formation of the NAACP, African Americans were still facing massive, deeply entrenched hurdles. Du Bois found himself totally disillusioned by cautious leaders like President Taft, and Woodrow Wilson proved completely beholden to the segregated South. Even popular culture was reinforcing these barriers. D.W. Griffith's 1915 blockbuster film Birth of a Nation actively praised the Ku Klux Klan, directly quoting Woodrow Wilson's own historical writings to do it. And this cultural backing sparked a huge revival of the Klan. So as we wrap up this explainer, we're looking at a society in 1914 where the legal framework of Jim Crow is totally locked in and violence is being largely ignored by the state. Yet at the exact same time, a resilient middle class and a powerful new activist vanguard have just been born. So we have to ask ourselves, how did this volatile mixture of immense pain and quiet progress permanently shape the massive struggles for equality that were yet to come? How did it lay the groundwork for the modern civil rights movement? Think on that.